thanks, Michael, for joining us. I know you're super busy, and we're very honored that you took time to talk to us for a little bit. So for those that don't know, Dr. Michael Mina is an assistant professor of epidemiology at Harvard School of Public Health, and he's in the Center for Communicable Disease and Dynamics, where we get a lot of speakers from for this the parts of the series dedicated to COVID. Caroline is coming up soon too, and what the reason we have you today is because you, as far as among the people that I follow and read, you're the one person I looked to for information about testing, high throughput testing, and all other things related to measuring who has the disease and how many people have it and all this. So I know that you do research in that area too. So those that are more interested in learning more, you can check out Michael's page and papers. All right, thanks. So our audience is mostly data scientists, statisticians. If I get cut off, I will send Erica the questions. Apologies to everybody for the internet issues. Okay, so I'll just get right to it. I have some pretty introductory questions just to get our listeners that aren't experts in testing and particular COVID.
So the first question that Rafa sent me was, can you explain the differences between a molecular test and a serological test?
Sure. Yeah, so this has come up a lot. So the molecular test, when we say that, we're usually referring to, in this case, the test that looks for the virus. And that might be PCR, it might be antigen test. And so, but either way, these are tests that if somebody's infected, we want to know, do they have the virus in them? So that's what the molecular tests are doing. The serological test is looking for the antibodies or the immunological response to the virus. So when somebody gets infected, usually there will be an incubation period, which might last for a few days before they turn positive on a molecular or viral test. And then very quickly, the virus will replicate exponentially inside the individual. The molecular test will be very, very high. And people's, the viral load will be high, potentially 1 billion or 1 trillion viral particles per mil. And then it will start to subside again a week later or a few days later even. Afterwards, you end up seeing around 7 days post-symptom onset in general. So far, what we've been able to see is that the antibody test starts to become positive. And that's because people's B cells and plasma cells start to produce antibodies. So that essentially gives you more of a picture of whether somebody's been exposed to the virus or infected, and whether they, and potentially whether they are immune to it. And we're still working out what are the best assays and tests to use to take the serological data, somebody's blood, and be able to say whether or not they are actually immune. And so we're working on both of those types of tests, but one essentially gives you exposure history and even recency of exposure, and then one gives you current infection history. But there's in particular for people who might be modeling this virus mathematically or the transmission of this, just having a PCR positive test, a molecular test being positive, does not imply transmissibility. In fact, probably, and the data, this is hard data to actually derive from population studies without sort of human challenge experiments things, but getting at transmission and how people might stay positive for 6 weeks or 8 weeks, but they will not necessarily be transmitting for more than just a small fraction of that time. The transmissibility period might only be 4 or 5 days. Meanwhile, their molecular tests can stay positive for very long periods of time, which means that for a lot of people who we find are positive through surveillance programs, they're actually long past their transmission point. And so it actually throws into question the purpose of contact tracing for a lot of these individuals. And it also sort of suggests that antibody testing might be just as powerful a tool for outbreak detection as regular surveillance.
Okay, I think Ralph is still frozen. So his next question is, so is it the case that detected cases we should be exclusively using molecular tests?
Molecular tests, if you can get a fast turnaround time, then molecular tests can be very powerful to stop transmission before it happens from individuals and to get outbreaks under control. At the moment, the molecular tests that we use usually have delays. First, people are often only getting tested when surveillance is not testing individuals very frequently. Most people who find that they're positive, like I was just mentioning, are sort of already beyond their period of having transmissible virus. And then those people that we find that we actually do get a swab from when they are transmissible, a lot of them aren't getting their results back until after they've cleared the virus or have stopped transmitting because there's such delays. So that suggests that antibody testing, even though antibodies have a 4 to 7 day or so delay after symptom onset before they become positive, what it suggests is that they can be used very powerfully for surveillance efforts. They're not the right test to know, are you positive today? Can you go and should you not walk into a nursing home or something? But they are the right test to do at a population scale to sort of blanket the population with serological tests for antibodies and follow people longitudinally. So maybe you're following in a given town of 100,000, you follow 10,000 people serologically for antibodies, their status. And then when you see people seroconvert, meaning they go from a negative to a positive antibody test, that then represents that somebody in that interval became infected and probably recovered by then. So then you once you identify those using serological tests, then you go in and start doing viral testing to control the outbreak. That's an efficient way from a population public health perspective, I think, to tackle this virus.
So can I ask a follow-up? So you're saying that we do, because I might have missed this part, we can do serologicals, and if it comes out positive, then you go back and do molecular.
Yeah, I think it would, not on the individual though, but we would use it for detecting when an outbreak is happening. So let's say you're the governor of New York or you're the mayor of New York City, and you want to know, and you're or let's say you're Governor Baker. We're in Massachusetts, and you want to know, are cases happening today in Massachusetts? Right now, I would say we're generally in Massachusetts, we're in peacetime. We have cases are pretty low. And so the idea that we would just be testing everyone in our state every week with an expensive virus test, that might be overkill during peacetime. And it might actually even be not very sensitive. We know that a lot of people will get viral infections and then they'll clear them before you even get the PCR test into them. An antibody test, once it becomes positive, it's very likely to stay positive, at least for months. It might wane after a couple of months, as we're seeing, and there's implications there, but not huge ones for outbreak detection. So what we could do is we could say, okay, antibody testing is cheaper, it can be done faster, and more broadly because it's cheaper. So you can get it to a lot more people, and it can be done just with a finger prick of blood, just a small drop of blood, or even potentially saliva. So that means you have as many people as possible doing serological antibody testing. And when you start to see a signature of increased cases in the population, then you dive in and you do damage control, or you start to control it with PCR testing. But you
I see. Interesting. So the point is that it's not to detect who has it, it's to know if the population average has been growing in a worrisome trend. That's exactly the idea.
Yeah, and that's where public health, I've been trying to push this idea that for certain things in individual medicine, it's important to know if one person's infected. But when we're talking about an acute respiratory virus and we're trying to control the population growth of this virus, if we focus on detecting every single case, we're going to drive ourselves crazy and bankrupt. But if we can focus, so we can't prevent every single case, but we can prevent every single outbreak from growing.
I see.
And so that's where I think if we change our sort of view of what the goal is, the goal should be to stop every outbreak. It was never, and that was always the thing with flattening the curve. It was never get cases to absolute zero, but keep them at a manageable level.
I see. Interesting. Okay. So, but is it true? My understanding is that with the molecular test, with the serological test, if someone's just has the virus, but it's just in the start, it won't come out positive. That's correct, right? So, but what you're saying is that that's not the point. The point is, if the serological tests go up, it means that it must mean that there's more cases than there used to be in the population, and that's when you then take some other action, like start testing more broadly, or maybe trying to find this place where it happened.
Yeah, and if you're following the same person longitudinally, say every month or something, or every 2 weeks, then you would actually know, okay, this individual clearly had an exposure. And frankly, there's been so much, so many people say, for example, to me, well, you can't use antibodies for outbreak detection because they come up too late. They develop 7 days after symptom onset or 10 days after symptom onset, and by that period, you're no longer transmitting. My response is, at the moment, most people who are getting tested for the virus are getting tested. They're becoming, if they're positive, almost everyone, not everyone, but the average person in Massachusetts right now who is testing positive through routine surveillance, not symptomatic exposures or anything, but just surveillance, they are generally being recognized as positive probably by far after they've been transmissible. They probably even already have antibodies by the time they're getting that swab taken.
Yeah,
and that's because these sort of the viral kinetics are asymmetric. You have this really rapid growth of virus, and then you have a long tail. And so we're finding people in that long tail, which by that point, my guess is their antibodies have actually already come up. So we'd probably be doing even better if we just used antibody testing, at least than we're doing right now.
Interesting. Well, that's very different than what I've been hearing from a lot of expert or people who call themselves experts. So now there's a question from the audience that's related. What is the average false negative rate for the molecular and serological tests?
Yeah, so the average false negative rate for the molecular test, it's very dependent on time. So you'll have a very strong signal for molecular tests at a period when somebody's transmitting, but that window of time is very short. So a lot of people have been very antsy about the sensitivity of these tests. But almost everyone, if you're getting them in, maybe you'll miss, most tests will miss people at the very beginning of their infection. So in the incubation phase, the virus load is just too low to be detectable on a PCR, and the sensitivity is going to be abysmal. Once the virus starts growing exponentially, then you actually move through orders of magnitude or logs of growth within a few hours, really, and within a day. So even between the time, this is from a kinetics perspective, you could take the most sensitive test in the world and just a pretty subpar test. And the only difference in terms of their sensitivity is going to be on the order of hours. If you happen to test people in this time between when the high sensitivity test turns positive and then the low sensitivity test will turn positive, it's really a very short window of time.
Interesting. So just to be clear, I think I understand you. I want to make sure everybody's with us. That when you say that the virus is growing, you're talking about inside a human's body,
yeah,
not in the population.
Yes. Yeah, sorry. There's different scales that I'm talking about. Yeah. And so the false negative will be, you'll get a lot of false negatives early on during incubation period. Almost everyone who's incubating the virus, but it's not yet amplifying, is going to be false negative. And then you'll get very, very good sensitivity, but it generally doesn't exceed around 80% still. And that's just the virus might be growing in somebody's GI system, might be growing in lungs. For some reason, some people just are not really able to be detected at any given time during their course of infection. And then as the virus subsides in somebody, the different tests will lose sensitivity faster. But I think the point that I want to make, though, is that most tests will, at the moment that somebody's transmitting the virus might be 1 billion or 1 trillion viral particles per mil. And so at that point, almost pretty much any test on the market, or even not on the market, some of these poor ones that are trying to get pushed through, will detect people at the point of transmissibility. But because of the swabbing and just sampling collection, that automatically knocks you down 15 or 20% in sensitivity, it seems. Mm-hmm. So that has to do with the biology of where the virus grows. The serological tests tend to get very high sensitivity, but not until about 7 to 10 days after symptom onset. But at that point, the sensitivity of the serological antibody test can actually greatly exceed that of molecular testing. They get very, very sensitive because most people, if you're infected, will develop antibodies. And now the tests have gotten very accurate. Tests are nearly 100% sensitive and 99.6 or 8% specific. So very, very few false positives as well.
Interesting. Okay. So this is another related question. So the serological test will detect as long as you have the antibody. So is there any, do you have current estimates of how long that is? So the related question from the audience is, how reliable are recent reports that immunity to COVID fades after a couple of months? Could there still be immunity even if antibodies cannot be found anymore?
Absolutely. So there's two parts to this. A lot of people have been thinking that this virus is sort of an anomaly in viruses, and that this is an alien virus from another planet and working with our body totally different. I want to be very clear that as an immunologist who studies acute viral infections, almost every part of this virus is textbook. It's acting actually exactly how we would anticipate. Even the antibody responses are acting exactly how we anticipate. The viral kinetics are. And so the reason I say that is we actually know a lot about this idea that immunity is waning over time is true. We do believe that antibodies are likely waning. And this is expected. This is the reason why it looks so different than what we would normally see for other coronaviruses, for example, is that this is a primary infection. People the antibodies that we're seeing, they grow very rapidly because you have an amazing expansion of plasmablasts in your body. These are the cells that secrete the antibodies. The way that the body handles a new virus, especially if it doesn't already have pre-built-in immune memory from past infections, is it needs to expand plasmablast cells from a few to billions, within a very short amount of time. And these cells also create huge amounts of antibody. And so, of course, in a very short duration of time, you're going to have sky-high antibodies when you're trying to battle this infection. But your bodies can't sustain that level of plasmablasts in the blood, and they can't sustain that level of antibody for a given virus for very long. So, of course, those plasmablasts are going to contract, they apoptose, they die off, and the antibodies then wane. That is an expected dynamic of an antibody response for a primary infection. And it's exactly why we normally have to give kids booster shots for vaccines, because we know that primary responses wane quickly. And boosting is re-exposures, and boosting is kind of a slow buildup of immunity over time, of really long-lived immunity.
But that doesn't, yeah, so, but that means that if people who got it, they are immune for, we think, quite a while, because even if the levels are low, you still have enough to reactivate the immune response, correct?
Exactly. And so the antibodies don't tell the antibodies that are circulating. So before I was talking about like peacetime in the population. Now, if we talk about peacetime in the body, we have, just because your body's not pumping out tons of antibody, it still has already recognized the pathogen. So there's a good chance, and this is something that we're trying to research now, we being the more global immunology community, to understand once antibodies wane, do you still have an anamnestic response kind of ready to go, meaning a secondary and memory response ready? So if you get exposed again, maybe you'll still be protected either through T cells or even through antibodies. They're just not being pumped out at a level during peacetime that is detectable, because the plasma cells that normally do that live in the bone marrow and you don't have enough of them. But your body still would recognize it and the memory has still already been preformed at that point during a second exposure. So it's very likely that people will still remain at least partially protected if they get exposed a second time, if not fully protected.
Mm-hmm. Good, thanks. Another question from the audience, and it's one of the ones similar to one I was going to ask, is how does Massachusetts prevent a surge in cases moving forward so we don't become what's happening in other states like California, Texas, Arizona, Florida? We had the state epidemiologist speak a couple of weeks ago, and they showed us some of the data, and it looked really good for Massachusetts, at least the trends. So I'll add that before letting you answer.
Yeah, so Massachusetts has done an exceptional job, I would say, at getting cases down. We had a very large outbreak here, first wave, and we got it under control, I would say, pretty successfully. But if we but I think I'm very concerned that we will be resting on our laurels saying, okay, we're done with that. And we're seeing that we're opening up, we're in phase, we're opening up into phase 3 and potentially beyond. And I think that that is a dangerous proposition. We have to be very careful as we open up. And I'm starting to suggest that we preempt this. We don't wait and do the reactionary thing that pretty much has defined this epidemic, that we actually say, we look around, we have a lot of priors at this point to work with. And we say, this is what even states that have gotten it under control are now experiencing increased cases. What have they done? They've opened up. So is there a state that we can get into where we actually, I mean, obviously this has to be taken in light of the economic consequences too, but I think that we should actually consider rolling back our opening a little bit and take baby steps backwards in order to not have to take giant leaps backwards later on.
You're saying because of what we're seeing in the South, we should do this?
Yeah, I think we're seeing just how dangerous this virus is. I think there was a lot of hope that, we got it under control and that it's going to stay that way. But if we can learn anything from what's happening all around us in the South and the West, it's that the virus isn't done. It's only done right now in Massachusetts, or it's only deep down at the moment because we've been shut down. And doesn't mean that if we open up, it's going to stay down. If we open up, we're going to look like everywhere else. These cases are coming in. We still have daily cases here. And I don't think that, that's not a satisfying answer, but I think that it's going to be, I don't want to see us become Florida, in the next few months.
Yeah. So one thing I've thought about, I don't have any data, I just thought about it, is that I wonder if there's something about how we behave that's very different across states, that it might have even a bigger impact than the lockdowns themselves. Like when I go out here in the more dense areas of Massachusetts, I see, I don't know, 90% of the people wearing masks, maybe more. And when you're in a store, it's everybody. And that's gotta, I think now that has to have some positive effect. And I guess one thing I can ask you related to this is, do you have any thoughts on what are the more dangerous parts of the reopening that you're concerned about? Like, is it like indoor? I've read papers now talking about indoor transmission being much worse than we thought, and outdoor transmission not being that bad. But I would like to hear what an expert has to say about that.
Yeah, so I agree with both of those. I think that obviously we have different behavior. I think something that helped us get cases so low is we have a pretty strong culture of wearing masks at this point in Massachusetts. My concern with the openings, on the one hand, it makes, as we reopen, it sends in some ways conflicting messages. Okay, we can reopen things but at the same time, still be careful. I think that that's good. We just have to have messaging right. So if we all wear masks as much as possible, that alone will keep cases down. They work very, very well. My concern is opening up things like movie theaters and indoor restaurants and bars. We're moving towards that direction, and those are places where people generally aren't going to be wearing their masks. And they're going to be sitting indoors in places, that are relatively cramped compared to outdoors, and just the atmosphere outdoors in terms of the airflow alone makes an enormous difference to prevent transmission of this virus. And so I think once we move indoors, people touch the same surfaces more, they take off their masks more, and that's where I think the reopening strategies can get us into hot water. So I am in favor of opening certain things, especially like the outdoor patios that we're seeing in restaurants. I think the risk of transmission there is pretty low, but still trying to limit who you're congregating with is still an important piece as well. If you have a big birthday party or something, if you're all crowded around a little table outside and there's 20 of you, that's still a pretty high risk endeavor, regardless of inside or outside, I would say.
Okay, So some questions about the past. So can you tell us a little bit about what happened in the United States and why it took so long to start testing?
Yeah.
The short version of the story.
Yeah, so what really happened there was the U.S., unlike other countries, has the problem started in February, and that was the public health emergency declaration by the CDC put into place an emergency use authorization requirement for testing. This is these EUAs that you might be hearing about. Does this test have EUA? Does that test have EUA? This is an FDA mandated thing during an epidemic. And the idea is to create quality control over the tests that are available. And so it was something, and it's because at the beginning of an epidemic, there's such high risk of being either right or wrong about a case existing. And an extreme example is Ebola. If you tell somebody that they have Ebola, that will cause massive, if you falsely tell somebody that they have Ebola, that will cause massive disruptions in a population. If you falsely miss somebody who actually has Ebola, that will also cause massive disruptions and deaths. And so the EUA is designed to ensure that during an epidemic or other emergency, that the type of the strategy, if it's approved, if it's one that has to go through the FDA, is one that is vetted. And that in this case, it's tests, if the tests are vetted by the FDA first. That makes sense, except when you have a very rapidly spreading viral infection like this. The EUA ended up handcuffing the laboratories and not allowing us to get testing, not even allowing us to innovate on testing throughout February. And so it allowed, the most up-to-date information suggests that there were tens of thousands of cases in New York City, for example, before the first tests even got approved to be run. So that was sort of a blunder and I hope a learning lesson. I don't know that we'll learn from it, but I hope that the CDC and FDA will learn from it to recognize what should be the restrictions from an EUA versus just allowing tests to be deployed. There's a lot of good labs that know how to make molecular tests even against a novel virus, so we should have probably allowed that to just happen right off the bat. Since then, and more recently, and today, we're just running out of test capacity. We don't have a good way to load balance the system. Probably across the country, we do have pretty good test capacity. In Massachusetts, we have tens of thousands of additional tests every day that could be run, but the demand isn't there. Meanwhile, we have LabCorp and Quest in the South and West with 6 or 8 day delays. So we're not load balancing the system properly. We have centralized testing. We're sending a huge number of tests over here. Meanwhile, we have unused tests over here. And we're so fragmented as a country that we don't really have a good way to figure this out, on a state across states. It makes it very, very difficult for the response to happen across states because we're fragmented.
That's interesting. So in your answer, you gave me an example of a case where you think there was too much government intervention. And you also gave me an example of a case where there's not enough government interaction. So I wonder if you think that like in the future, we should just, for testing, just let it be, let the free market just let it go. Yeah, I guess you have to have some kind of way to approve the test, but it could be quick. And then on the other side of this organization part, then you definitely have a very strong government issued set of rules of how we're gonna share data and with that data then distribute whatever materials are needed. Is that something you think you would recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the defining features of the U.S. response has been a lack of leadership, and that's why the federal interventions that have been put in place have all, they've however well-intentioned, they've been poor or non-existent. So I don't think it has to be an either or, like government's either bad at doing it or good at doing it. I think better leadership would probably have recognized that this whole EUA issue early on was really a problem, and would have, if there was better oversight, we weren't. Remember, in February, we have to remember that the federal government was still pretending like this wasn't an important virus to deal with. And so I think that, that led to some issues. And now we have a complete lack of oversight at the federal level that would enable states to work together and load balance the system. So one very clear way that I think federal government could step in a pretty straightforward way that would probably solve problems. And I recently wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about this with Larry Kotlikoff, and we discussed this idea that there could be really cheap, super cheap tests that could be made and distributed to millions of Americans for almost daily use and funded by the federal government.
This would be serological.
No, these could even be antigen detection strips, like little pregnancy test type of test strips. And I could picture a day, not in the too distant future. These exist right now is the thing. They're just not, without going too much into detail, they're just not as sensitive as we might hope. But if you could have somebody taking it every day instead of just once, then the sensitivity really increases it because they would work on the day that you're transmitting. So, and they're cheap. You can make huge paper sheets of these and slice them into 1,000 different tests and give everyone 50 of them to use for 2 months. That, I think alone, if everyone had that knowledge on a given day, are they positive, then I think people would make the right choices. And the federal government could fund those companies to manufacture these quickly, could put up the money. We're talking about an epidemic that's costing trillions of dollars. Putting billions into getting tests into everyone's hands on a given day, this would, sure, it would be tens or hundreds of millions a day. But if you do that for 2 months, maybe we'd actually get this really under control.
And just to be clear, the way that helps is that once you see you have it, you quarantine yourself. Yep.
Yeah, you don't even have, the nice thing there is you don't even necessarily, if everyone's doing it, you don't even have to do contact tracing, because you would just stop yourself, you'd quarantine, and if you had already passed it to somebody maybe last night, if it was negative yesterday morning, you probably weren't transmitting yesterday. Maybe the virus would have grown during the course of the day to the point where you would have transmitted it to one person last night. And people would all make their decisions based on sure, you'd have a few bad apples that still go to work, but for the most part, most people, if they saw that they were positive, would probably stay home and might even do their own due diligence and call their friends and say, hey, I was positive, we were together last night. So I think that it could stop the virus pretty rapidly if we would push for it. The problem is the FDA really has a very high standard for the individual sort of analytic molecular sensitivity, but there's no pathway to ask the question of what is the sensitivity of a testing regimen or a testing program. So you don't need a very sensitive test if you're using it daily. And because then and I would make the argument that the current regimen of testing with the very high sensitivity PCR tests, they have a sensitivity of probably less than 5% at the moment to detect people at the time that they're infectious. So essentially we have a failing surveillance program.
So that reminds me of a question I have about this. So let's say we use the molecular test only, just for this question, and I compute the positivity rate. That is an estimate that is biased, and it could be biased in either direction. It could be biased because not everybody is getting tested, so we're missing many, so that would mean it's an underestimate. But probably more likely, in my view, is the opposite, is that people who have the symptoms go and get tested, so it's an overestimate. Do you have a sense for how good this estimate is and which way the bias goes?
So what you were just referring to in many ways is, I think it's two different levels of sensitivity. One is the sensitivity to actually detect the virus.
Yeah, so I'm talking about, let's suppose it's perfect.
Yeah.
The test is perfect. You still have biases because of who's getting tested.
Oh, yeah.
Of what the population parameter is, the population prevalence.
Yeah, so exactly. So you're exactly to your point. I think that it's biased the wrong way, or not the wrong way. It's biased in the direction that it looks like the test is much better than it is. And that's where serological testing is helping get at the ground truth here, and shows that we're missing 90% of all positives. So that's the sensitivity of the surveillance program right now is 10% max, and beyond that, most of the positives that we're detecting are being detected after their time of transmissibility.
Okay.
Probably
So when Massachusetts says there's 2% the positivity rate, what would you give us a range of what you think the actual percentage of the population that's infected right now is? Is it more than 2 or less than 2?
More. If we're detecting 2% on the using virus PCR at the moment, my guess is probably 1 out of 10 people infected are actually being detected through the programs we have set up. Now, Massachusetts is on the better side, so it could be 1 in 5. We do have a lot of testing available, but every single day I have people asking me.
No, but see, I'm asking, I see. I wasn't clear. You answered a different question than I was trying to ask. What I'm saying is that, let's suppose I'm interested in the proportion of the population that's infected. Right, so the positivity rate tells me, if I just take it at heart, it's 2%, right? But that could be, what I was saying is that 2% could be too high because people with symptoms get tested. Could be too low because, you know, we're for whatever reason, we're not testing everybody, or there's a big size of the population that is infected and we're not testing. So that's what I'm asking, is like, is it fair to think that about 2% of the Massachusetts population is infected right now?
No, that's way high.
That's why it's less.
It's orders of magnitude less than that. 2% of the
that's what I thought. Okay.
Population would have been beyond what we ever reached in April.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Interesting, huh? Okay. All right. So I have one more question for the audience, and then I'll ask you one more.
Oh, wait. Let me just.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So there's a big difference here. So are you asking about 2% of the population being infected today, or the cumulative incidence?
Today.
Oh yeah. So I think it's probably, you know, at max it's probably 2 per 100,000, and it's probably, you know, maybe a little bit higher than that per 100,000 in terms of true positivity.
Okay, well, that's good to know. I can look at people less suspiciously. So one question for the audience: would you expect there to be a difference in antibody test sensitivity in children versus adults and across different races?
Well, that's a great question. I think that if we were actually to look at the sensitivity of antibodies to detect people who have been infected, I think it would be a pretty good sensitivity across the board for kids and adults. The biggest, I think that the elderly in the population will probably wane the quickest. And so if you see people in nursing homes and you go and test them for serological responses, you might see elderly lose their positivity on antibodies very quickly. That's not unique to this virus, that's unique to every pathogen. But otherwise, I think that we will see everyone is sort of experiencing this virus in some ways the same way at an immunological level. Of course, adults and older people are getting much more ill, but the antibody response is going to be pretty good in people. Now, it does seem to be a bit stronger in people who really get a bad infection. And so it could be that children on average have a lower antibody response than adults, just because adults, it seems that the virus grows to such higher levels.
So there's more actual virus molecules in the body.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know, it's interesting. We don't really know that for sure. With the people who get really sick, it seems to be, but at the same time, we've seen, at least from what we can glean from the swabs, we've seen that kids and adults actually have pretty similar virus titers. So it's an open question. In general, but I would say somebody who actually gets very sick and ends up in the hospital probably has more virus in their body than somebody who's asymptomatic.
All right. Well, I'll ask you one last question and let you go. So, and I asked you about the past, now about the future. So can you just tell us what you think we could be doing better right now at Harvard, in Massachusetts, and the United States and the world, as it relates to testing or whatever else you want to comment on?
Yeah, I think what we could be doing better, certainly, I think we could be better at preparing for what might come next. I think we're just not very good at that. We're not good at creating very clear, crisp definitions of when we're going to roll back openings. We're not good at creating the surveillance systems that are really needed. So if I had infinite resources, the first thing I would do would be to create a very strong integrated network of surveillance that would allow us to know, I want us to be able to not have to do individual sort of serological surveys. I want us to have a way to routinely be using all of the data and blood collections that are existing, in hospitals and clinics, blood donors, ever else, to be able to sort of create serological surveillance that is just an ongoing thing, like the weather system. I think that if we did that, not just for this virus, but for other viruses, I want to be able to open up my iPhone, type in a zip code, and have it tell me what the risk of going out into public is today for transmission, or for getting a virus. And if we could really think forward and say, what does it take to prevent transmission from happening and outbreaks from happening? I think we need to preempt where the outbreaks are going to occur in the same way that we preempt where hurricanes are going to land. And I believe that we can do that with enough computing power and with enough data. So that's where I think we have an immense ability to measure things these days and to integrate huge amounts of data. And public health has just been underfunded for so long that we haven't been doing it well in this regard, and we're seeing the consequences of it. So I think that we should start to leverage some of these different tools and technologies and data streams that we could be building and actually use it to forecast viruses and understand what's happening next.
Great. Well, this has been really educational and informative. So once again, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to do this. And we will be in touch. Thanks again.
Sure. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.